Hi friends, it's Lisa Hetrick, illustrator for Gina K Designs, and I'm so grateful you could join me today. I have a little bit of a different tutorial for you today. We are going to talk about no-line watercoloring, and we're going to work with the Pear in the One Day at a Time stamp set with Gina K Designs, brand new stamp set release that I have with Gina K. And I want to walk you through a really simple technique. And instead of focusing on card making, we're going to focus on the technique of the no-line watercoloring. And you can see that this Pear here, this is the inspiration for what we're going to do. This is a really great image to learn no-line watercoloring on because it's very, very large. And there are other elements in the stamp set that can help build this out a little bit. So you can take a peek here. This stamp, all said and done, when I build the stem and the leaves, is about 4 inches high. So it's going to be really easy for us to learn some watercolor techniques in the context of this particular stamp. So this tutorial is a little bit different because we're focusing on no-line watercoloring in a really large stamped area. Let's do a quick look at the supplies. I've got sweet corn here. I'm going to stamp out all of the Pear elements in sweet corn, just one ink color. I've got some ready cut watercolor paper from Strathmore. I really like this paper. I've been getting into it lately for paper crafting. It's 100% cotton, which makes it super nice. I've got the One Day at a Time stamp set, blocks. I have some watercolor. You can grab whatever watercolor set you have in your stash. This is the one I'm using. I'm going to be using some of this, the greens and the yellows in this set. This set is from Schmincke. And again, all of the supplies I'm using are listed down below in the description. And I'm going to play with some of these new Schmincke granulating colors. Been dying to use them. I'm also trying out some new watercolor brushes, and they're listed down below as well. So now let's go ahead and dive in and get started. The first thing that we're going to do is build out the actual scene. And that is with the large Pear image, the leafery, and you're just going to grab the solid leaf. We're going to stamp that twice, and we also have the stem. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that on my block, and I'm going to ink this up, the whole thing up in sweet corn. And the reason why is my dominant color in the Pear is going to be that yellow ochre color, that yellowish warm yellow color. So and I'm using the green, and the green that I'm using is more leaning towards the yellow side as well. So using this stamp color, sweet corn, is just going to help make those lines become invisible. So it's going to look like you actually just painted the Pear versus stamped the Pear down and colored it in. So that's one really super simple way to do no-line watercoloring is pick the lightest color and for an ink pad that you can use that kind of goes with the temperature and the colors that you're using for your watercolor medium or for your marker mediums. So you can see that I'm stamping out the silhouette leaf, and that is a solid. That's okay. We're going to be coloring, we're going to be watercoloring over top of it. So I'm starting out with a really large watercolor brush, and this is a number 10 round. You can see I'm just dipping the brush into the water, and I'm following the lines of the Pear, and all I'm doing right now is painting with water. I want to get this Pear nice and juicy and wet so that I can drop my watercolors in. Now, this technique that I'm doing is called wet into wet. You can see some of the sweet corn because it is a water-based ink is starting to kind of come up. And that's okay. We're just going to blend it right in with the watercolor. This is such a fun shape to paint and such a really easy shape to work with. So this wet into wet technique is going to feel kind of magical. I love this technique. You're painting with water first, and you can see I'm putting down I'm just kind of preparing my color a little bit. I've got that yellow ochre color, which is a really, really warm yellow, and I've got this green color here that I'm just kind of getting these colors down onto my mat here so that I have them accessible and ready to go when I want to drop them into the wet area of the pear. So again, the paper is dry except for the pear area. I have already painted in some water there. So you can see I'm taking the Schmincke watercolor. You're going to use whatever watercolor you have in your stash, and I'm dropping it into this area. Now, depending upon what watercolor brand you're using, some of the watercolor might just start to spider out. It'll just hit the water and it'll just start to flow out. Schmincke is not one of those colors, brands. It tends to stay where I put it. It moves a little bit, but I really love this particular brand because it's super, super transparent. So you see me moving this color around a little bit more with a brush. Now, depending upon the brand that you're using, some of your color is just going to spider out and just move through the water. And the watercolor is only going to go where the water is. So you can see that it's not going outside of the lines of the pear here. Okay, I've got a little layer in there. Now I'm going back in and I'm dropping in some of that yellow ochre over on the left-hand side of the pear. And I'm just letting the watercolor do its thing. You can see I'm moving it around a little bit and I'm letting the two colors kind of bleed together. I've got some pools of color up at the top and over to the side, and I'm literally just going to let it be. I'm going to go ahead and take this whole thing off camera and just take my heat tool and just dry it out. Now you could just let it dry, air dry, but I just want to kind of expedite this a little bit. Now take a look at what has happened. So this is what happens with watercolor. Watercolor, no matter what brand you're using, will shift a bit, and that means it will fade back. So you can see that some of this color is not as bright and vibrant as it was a couple minutes ago. So, and I also have these blooms because I had so much water going. So I can take a brush and just kind of, if I don't want those hard edges, I'm kind of just going in with a wet brush, no paint on the brush, and just blending it out a little bit. And normally with blooms, I just leave them because I love them. So now I'm just going to I'm going to go ahead back in and we're going to do a technique called glazing. So we've got a dry layer and now I'm going back in over top of this dry layer with my wet brush with paint on it. The paper is dry, my brush is wet, and you can see that I'm just moving that color around and I'm controlling it a lot more. This technique is called wet into dry, where you're actually placing your watercolor where you want it to be and you're moving it around where you want it to be. So it's a very controlled technique, but I'm also doing a technique called glazing, or a simplified way of saying it is layering. I'm starting to build up the vibrancy or the glow of the watercolor layers underneath by adding layers over top. When you're working with a watercolor brand, mostly all watercolors, some colors are more transparent than others. This particular brand, Schmincke, is very, very transparent. There will be some watercolors that you might have in your stash that are kind of opaque, but you're going to be able to tell the difference. So as I'm layering these colors, you can see that it's more intense over on the right hand side because I'm glazing in, layering in more color. I'm also adding in some of that yellow ochre and I'm dropping it in exactly where I want it to be, kind of focusing on those edges a little bit so that those no line areas are starting to disappear. And you can see where the yellow ochre is meeting the green we're getting another like color mix, and it's just coming together really, really nicely. I'm loving the way this looks. You can see I'm dropping in a little bit of yellow ochre here and letting the water just kind of move it around. I'm resisting the urge for smoothie blends. What I call a smoothie blend is trying to blend everything out and control what the watercolor is doing. I'm going to let these two colors just mix mash together and do their thing. Now I'm moving on right now. I've got a little bit of this red ochre color and yellow ochre together. It's actually, and just kind of mixing it together to play with the color I'm going to use on my stem. I've added, also just dropped in a little bit of that sepia color, and I'm just playing around with these neutral, natural tones here, just mixing these three colors together. I'm going to go ahead and just paint in my stem. Now, my brush is wet. There's pigment on my brush. The paper is dry. So this is a wet into dry technique, and I got a little schmutz up there, and that's okay. You can catch it pretty quick. Even though we're going to cut this image out, I'm just kind of showing you. You can catch it pretty quick by adding some water and then just dabbing it dry. Okay, so I'm going to go in here. I've got a little bit of that brown color on the stem. I'm just going to pick up a little bit more and just go ahead in and continue to paint out that stem. Now, I've got a lot of pigment on here. I've got a lot of color, and it's kind of juicy and wet. So I am going to let some of that color bleed down into the top of the pear where the green is. And then I'm going to clean off my brush here. My brush is completely clean, just only has water, and I'm going to pull away some of that brown color for the stem, just to get a little bit of variation of color here. Now, this is a super fun technique. I'm dropping in, my brush is clean, it's just got water, and I'm dropping in water into the watercolor while it's still wet, and the watercolor is spreading. It's just spreading around, and it's giving me the little bit of texture that I'm adding here with little kind of like white dots, but the color is just moving. So this color is permanent green olive, okay? This particular pigment is also kind of a granulating pigment. Let's talk about granulation for a minute. Granulation is the effect that you get when the pigment particles clump together rather than settling evenly on the painted surface. I just love working with granulating watercolors. They're super fun. They're not as super smooth, but they give you a lot of texture. Here's another example. This whole set right here for Schmincke is some of their new granulating colors that I've put into a pan. And I'm picking up some of this, what they call forest brown. And it is a granulating color. You can see it's a little bit different from that olive color. But when it dries, the pigments disperse and you get a lot of extra texture in your work. Now, every watercolor brand has granulating colors. So you can look at your brand and you can see which ones are granulating and which ones aren't. These from Schmincke are super granulating. They're intentionally designed for that. And there's also like other brands that have a lot of beautiful, beautiful granulating colors. Daniel Smith is another one that comes to mind I absolutely love. My favorite Daniel Smith green is called Cascade Green. It granulates so beautifully. If you've been around my channel for a while, you've seen I've used that color quite a bit for other projects. So I'm using that forest brown here, and I'm just using the leafery, the solid leaves, as my guide, and I'm painting over them. Now, some of that sweet corn is coming through. Even though this is a granulating color, it is very, very transparent. You can see some of that sweet corn coming through, but take a look at the pigment. See how the pigment said separated and we've got like those little dot-like texture in there? That's the granulating watercolors. This composition is starting to come together. Look at the pear. It looks like we hand painted this whole project, And really, it's just such a fun way to do no-line watercoloring. I'm a huge fan of no-line watercoloring. I just love doing it with larger stamps. Look at the pigments here. Look at how they're starting to separate. And you get that extra added texture and dimension. We've got some of that watercolor blooming. So it just is coming to life and has kind of a 3D look to it. Now that stem has dried off, faded back a little bit because it's dry, I'm just adding a little bit more of the brown to the stem just to give it a little bit more dimension. You can see I've got a little bit of blooming happening up here, and that means just that there was a lot of water in that area and it pushed back the watercolor. So it gives you a watercolor bloom. I actually love watercolor blooms. Some people don't like that. They really like everything to be kind of smooth. So you can see that I'm not overworking that bloom. I'm just letting the watercolor do its thing. So we've got variations of color here. We've got the greens, we've got the yellow, we've got a little bit of white happening. The colors are starting to granulate. Now that it's 100% dry right here, look at that. Look at those blooms. You can see like these little blooms of color where the water was pushing back the watercolor. Now, I'm just going to grab a wet brush that's not super soaky wet, and I'm just going to run my brush over some of those blooms to show you how you can blend them out a little bit. I personally would leave it alone because I like the extra texture and dimension. But look, you can totally reactivate the watercolor on the paper and just move it around a little bit. When I do this, I tend to overwork it and I'll make a big honkin' hole of color. So I'm trying really gently not to overwork it and create more blooms, and just so I can show you this technique in effect. So you can see the brush is wet, but it's not sopping wet, just a little bit. And I'm moving those little blooms around. And it kind of creates a little bit more texture. You can see I'm just kind of pushing some of that color around right on the paper, directly on the paper. It didn't get rid of the blooms completely. Oh, look at that granulation there from the forest brown. Look at all of that granulation happening in the entire pear. I diverted there a little bit. I just love the texture that's being created here with the watercolor coming together. Now, you can use the coordinating dies to cut this element out, but because we put the composition of these 3 stamps together, it's super easy to cut this out, to fussy cut this out with a pair of scissors. I'm just going around the edges and just cutting the whole element out, and it's going to be a big honkin' embellishment for my card project, for my next card project. So super simple, easy to cut out because it's a super simple shape, and I'm cutting it out right up to the edge of the stamped elements. So now take a peek at this. This is completely dry. You can see some of the blooms. Now you can see the original inspiration over here on the right, where I have less blooms and everything is a little bit more blendy. But this one, you can see all of the texture and all of the dimension and the blooms kind of happening. It's got a really nice watercolor effect. Kind of looks a little bit like working with alcohol inks, but it's got a lot of extra added personality because we worked with this wet into wet technique. We let the watercolor do its thing, and it's going to be a really great embellishment for my card. I hope you enjoyed this watercolor tutorial. Thanks so much for watching. Please consider sharing the joy by liking this video and subscribing to this channel. And you can watch more card and watercolor tutorials right here. So come on in and take a peek at my tutorials. I have a lot to share, and I'll see you next time.